everyone. Welcome to the New York Times Hub at COP26. And forgive me for just feeling my way through all these new protocols. This is normally a nightclub, but it's now been transformed into unquestionably the coolest venue at COP. And we at Tortoise are sharing it, and our mantra is cool it. This is the fourth full day at COP, and this is our second Think In here. And the subject is Goodbye Big Oil, Hello Mega Oil, question mark. Is that where we're headed? Just very quick, my name, by the way, is Giles Whittell. For those of you who haven't shared a Think In with me before, I'm an editor at Tortoise, and I'm joined by some great guests both here and online, who I'll introduce you to in a second. We are virtually all online for this event, but not entirely. Thank you very much for those who've made it through all the security for this early start this morning. Respect. Very briefly, how did we get here? About 2 years ago, I think, before COVID, we were having a Think-In on a related subject in our newsroom at Tortoise in London. And a member of the audience put his hand up and he said, by the way, it was about the oil majors. It was about Shell and BP and Chevron and Exxon. He said, I have spent my career in this industry. You do realize, don't you, that if all the oil majors, all the super majors, shut down tomorrow, you would still have about 80% of the world's oil supply controlled by national oil companies still selling oil, and the vast bulk of the problem from an environmental perspective still there. And frankly, I did not. The numbers that he offered then were a little off. I've done a little bit of homework. What we now call the oil majors produce about 15% of the world's oil. National and paradoxically termed international national oil companies, which refers mainly to Gulf ones, control between 58 and 65% of oil reserves. And that's expected to rise to about 3/4 as the majors, the publicly listed companies, start to divest. You can probably tell I'm busking. This is just a journalist's homework. If there are any experts online in the room who want to correct me on that, please do. That's part of the point here. But the big question that I'd like to address is, if we think that big oil pulling out of oil gradually is a big win for the environment, for climate, if it happens, are we kidding ourselves? You know, if divestment happens, as pretty much everyone in COP hopes, are we left with a problem on the scale that that Tortoise member who put me straight a couple of years ago indicated? And I would like also, if we can in the time, if we want to, if people want to get into the broader question of whether the whole COP process is a world unto itself and perhaps getting a bit divorced from the smelly, oily real world. In any case, there are many directions that we can head, and as in any thinking, it's really up to you. I just want to remind everybody to pile into the chat. My colleague Lara is there remotely. Lara, I guess you're down in London. It's weird, isn't it, that we're all in so many different places. Do pile in the chat. Raise your digital hands. We will come to as many of you as possible. First, I would like to come to Valerie Marcel. If you're there, Valerie. Valerie is an associate for... Hello.
Hello.
Chatham House, and you are across this issue. We talked a bit about it before. Can you give us an overview, just to start with, and please put me straight on any of those numbers if I need putting straight, on what you feel is the broad trend that we're looking at as the oil and gas sector, parts of it at any rate, begin to divest away from oil and gas and recast themselves as energy companies. To what extent are the national oil companies that are very often less reported on and less accountable picking up the slack, buying up the reserves, taking over the industry?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question because with, the divestment campaign has been attracting a lot of headlines and has had some positive impacts in really putting pressure on the oil majors and making them sort of stand up and take notice. But I think there are limits or drawbacks to this campaign because it could end up just moving the problem of dirty oil elsewhere. Um, so it's really affecting only a certain class of players. And what we could see is that, as the oil majors become international energy companies and they have to pull out of the assets that are the highest emitting, the dirtiest oil and gas, the gas that they don't feel able to invest in to control emissions, those assets are being picked up by national oil companies. But also, we should mention here, it's not just mega oil, it's traders that are pretty opaque, private, not listed companies. And so the question is it moving these assets to companies that are not as motivated or not as capable to control emissions? And I should put a caveat to that because really there is a question as to whether international oil companies have been that successful themselves at controlling emissions. I mean, we do see it varies from one field to the other in the Permian, and in Brent is one of the highest emitter crude. So it's a bit of a question mark, as you said at the beginning, in this sentence. So we can dig into that.
Briefly, by way of introduction, I mean, I confess I'm a sort of starting out on this whole subject. Is it fair to think of the national oil companies as a block, or is there a huge difference, for example, between Saudi Aramco's stewardship of its own footprint, which of course is large, but it is under more scrutiny than, say, the Venezuelan National Oil Company? Or is it fair to think of them as a block, or can, if you're still there, Valerie, I'm now looking at ourselves on the screen, or would it be useful to divide the category up by region, or are there, certain players which are more likely to try to make the kind of transition that the majors are making than others?
Yes, there's a huge variance between them, absolutely. And Saudi Aramco is one of those companies that's thinking very much long term. So they want to be able to sell their oil as long as possible, and they've made the choice that they need to make it as low emission as possible so that they have a market. But that's a class of NOCs that's motivated, self-interested to clean up their oil production. And that's capable of doing it, technically capable. But you have the whole gamut, and you have many NOCs that are not capable of reducing emissions. And you see that they're not really, they haven't been monitoring their emissions. They aren't deciding projects on the basis of what kind of risks they might take in terms of methane leakage or flaring or general emissions, and lack motivation because we're not putting the pressure points on them. And so I think that they're a bit the forgotten ones in this discussion, because there's been so much focus on Shell and Exxon and the others, which is important, and we've made great headway in changing their thinking. But we now need to turn our attention, I say, to the national oil companies that aren't really on top of this.
Valerie, can we just name those? We're not trying to demonize individual organizations, but which are the countries, which are the companies, the national oil companies, that need the scrutiny they're not getting at the moment?
Well, I mean, this is not a secret, because thankfully now we have such good satellite tracking data on methane leakage. We now know a lot more about emissions across the world. I mean, the highest GHG oil production in the world is Algeria. So that's Sonatrach. Then PDVSA in Venezuela, Cameroon, Iran, Turkmenistan, Indonesia, Sudan, Trinidad and Tobago. So those are countries with NOCs. And there are oil majors in those countries as well. So we can't put the full blame on the NOCs where IOCs are operating. But it really shows that, you know, there's a big challenge. And how do you motivate those NOCs to see how critical it is to reduce emissions? And it's important for overall world emissions, because the upstream scope 1 emissions are 8% of the well to tank emissions. So it matters that they clean up their act.
Right. And I don't want this, I mean, let's be clear, that part of the conversation has been about emissions from these companies' operations. But I do want to talk also about scope 3, in other words, about the actual emissions deriving from the oil and gas that they produced. Because the next question is, how do you motivate them to, what I always say, do a dong? In other words, Danish oil and natural gas changing to Ørsted being an entirely wind energy company. How do you bring pressure to bear on national oil companies whose host countries are completely dependent on their revenues to reinvent themselves as clean energy companies? Are we whistling in the wind there?
No, I think there's a natural, I'd say there's even a more natural path for these national oil companies to become national energy companies, because they're really focused on meeting the needs of their country and responding to their government's instructions. So, you know, traditionally they're focused on energy security for their country. That was the reason they were usually established, so that they didn't have to import oil and gas and be vulnerable to those imports. So they could feasibly transform into national energy companies. I think it depends on how capable they are. For starters, how, you know, what kind of transferable skills they have. And if they're a poorly run national oil company, we shouldn't expect that they're going to be a well-run national energy company, especially where, you know, profit margins are much less. We're not talking about a huge oil rent kind of, you know, golden goose. We're talking about a company that would have to run with a focus on cost reduction.
Right.
But, you know, I think one thing I wanted to raise though is that if we want to impact all companies across the board, whether private, super major, or national oil companies, there are some things that we could focus on more than divestment, and that would be taxing or costing carbon. So, you know, when Europe imposes its carbon border tax adjustment, that forces any company that wants to export its oil and gas to Europe to suddenly they're incentivized to reduce emissions and to bring them in line with European standards. Or when you have, if that were to, you know, be more of a worldwide kind of trend, that would put huge pressure on any company that trades oil and gas. And then similarly, you know, the new trend is really interesting in crude valuation to have the cost of carbon factor in the price of crude, so that the value of it reflects the carbon intensity. That also would put big pressure on any company that trades.
Valerie, thank you. That's a really interesting point, and it raises the whole question of whether a European carbon border tax would actually create a new zone of oil and gas dependent companies selling to each other or selling to other regions which don't have carbon border taxes beyond scrutiny and accountability. But we might come back to that. But this point that you made, that there is a pressure point for national oil companies, namely their governments, is a great segue to Akintunde Babatunde, who's right here with me. Thank you so much for being here. Came over from Edinburgh this morning. You are an ambassador for the One Campaign, a journalist, commentator, and originally from Abuja in Nigeria. And you've been reporting this week, among other things, on the fact that the president of Nigeria has been here and has made an announcement that Nigeria is aiming for net zero by 2060. But at the same time, Shell, which has sort of dominated a large part of Nigerian oil production, is, we understand, pulling out. So, Akintunda, give us your big picture take on what's going to happen to this vast business on which Nigeria depends in the next 5-10 years, if that is the trend, that Shell withdraws, who takes over?
Okay, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And I think before we talk about the president's pronouncement just the day before yesterday, I think I want us to just cast, I don't know if you've been following, the president had written an article just about 4 days before, where he said we can't talk about energy transition without talking about climate and energy justice. And he made strong point about the fact that he's not even sure that the alternative we have, renewable energy, would come without problems. So the article was clear about his position. Days before, the vice president have been making both claims about the fact that as much as the world wants Nigeria and developing countries to move away from oil, it's unfair, for developing countries or countries that would rely, heavily on these fossil fuel or whatever resources they have to be able to, fund their development agenda. The Nigerian government, despite the many potentials, the many years of oil exploration, the business and all, still, at the moment is not able to fund the development agenda. To put into context, the 2022 budget, about 16 trillion naira.
How much is 16 trillion naira in dollars, roughly?
That's pretty much. I'm not able to get it right now. But the problem is that out of the 16 trillion, the government would have to, get loan to fund about 6 trillion out of 16 trillion. I mean, despite the fact that the government still have oil as to bank on for now. So just imagine government now taking away oil, from that financials. Mm-hmm. What it means is that, the books are red. So that reflects the position of the vice president weeks earlier and the position of the president. So when the president was here day before yesterday and he made the bold claim about Nigeria looking forward to a net zero, by 2060, that was one, good to hear, in the context of the conversation. But if you look at the local reality, you discover that without an action plan, even if you have an action plan, the financials are not saying that. In Nigeria, there is no technology on ground, locally, for the government to be able to, to get onto that at the moment. Speaking of international oil companies leaving the country, people are taking over. One of the biggest refineries in the world now is being built by Dangote in Nigeria, in Lagos, Nigeria.
Being built by?
Dangote, Aliko Dangote.
Okay.
In Nigeria. He's a Nigerian who's building, a refinery in Lagos, Nigeria. What that means is that, and the Nigerian government recently passed the Petroleum Industry Act bill that has been ongoing for many years. And what that tells us is that as much as the conversations are here, at COP and all of that, what is ongoing in the country, repositioning the oil and gas sector, even the government himself, day before yesterday was saying, even though the government has done oil business for many years, Nigeria is potentially a gas-rich country. But the commitment, the body language speaks to the fact that government is still interested in the business of oil, realistically, because there is no alternative at the moment, on the ground. So if you look at all of that, part of the Shell's oil business in Nigeria was taken over by Air Holdings, an African business. And if you look at all of that, even the Oil Holdings have made the position clear that their own operation would be, energy, climate conscious and all of that. But the question is that if you look at the business environment, the human development indices, the books are red. So if the government would want to get as much financials as possible to be able to get out of poverty, Nigeria is sadly, on the red. Pretty much unemployment is high, insecurity is there, there's glass fairing, you have a lot of environmental degradation across spaces. The host communities, they're there. Jogoni cleanup, is there, unattended to for many years. So when we talk about the Nigerian government position, the global conversation about transition,
Right.
we have to pay attention to the local realities of extreme poverty, the local realities of the government being unable to fund its development agenda in the midst of all of this. So the government have been making money from oil, but in 2021, the government is planning to spend these financials, and a big part of the budget will even be to service debt.
Right.
So, and I mean, no good roads. I mean, no people are not able to walk. So if the agenda is on ground, we are able to have a publicly available document to say, okay, this is the plan, and we have not just the plan, but a workable plan. The one that is able to clearly let us know how the government aims to do this, and the political will. If you look at the political environment, the vice president was saying something else. The president had written an article, 2 days before to even cast doubt on the alternative that the world is speaking about.
Right.
So those are the issues.
So the president writes his article. He comes here and he says what COP wants to hear, namely, we will try to be aligned. We'll aim for 2060, but the country remains fundamentally dependent on oil and gas revenues.
Right.
And more of them are going to accrue to the local the Nigerian oil and gas industry. Now, I want to drill down on that a little bit. There's the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation, which is the NOC. But as you said, there's another company that's building the world's biggest refinery in Lagos as we speak.
Not the world, one of the biggest refineries.
Okay. There's Air Holdings that's taking over from Shell. And of course, Shell's presence in Nigeria has been controversial for decades, not least because of flaring and their relations with the local communities. Tell us a little bit more about these other private sector players in Nigeria. And about their intentions over the next 5-10 years. The Western majors are under immense pressure. We've seen shareholder activists move in and take over, install their own people on the board of Exxon, and shareholder activists doing the same thing with Shell. Are any of these pressures going to be brought to bear on the Nigerian private sector?
I think when people have problems, depending on the problem you have, the problem of Nigerians is hunger, right? Poverty. So they just want to eat. When you talk of, and that's why when you talk of agenda setting, when people in the Niger Delta, they are still particular about, say, even the recently passed
about
the Niger Delta people, the host community. So the petroleum industry bill had proposed, when they were working on it, the advocates and all of that about 10% would go to the host community, right? But when it was passed, about 3% was allocated to them. And, we talk about people who believe that this oil belongs to them, and whatever comes from it should be used to develop the community. People should be able to have access to good jobs and all of that. Then, people are interested in the financials that comes from there, right? And as much as the climate consequences of flooding, drought, and all of that, still abound in many vulnerable communities across space, I think what the pressure that comes with private sector will be, how are you able to, whatever engagement you are getting on, to be as much as possible to be clean, right? And so even because the question, there are figures there that says that the market is there. Nigeria's population is today about 200 million, but it will continue to advance in the coming years. And what that tells us is that the market is there in Africa, the market is there in Nigeria, for whatever business of oil that is happening, and most people don't care. If you ask an average Nigerian that what's your problem today, they tell you they just want to eat. That's it. About 45% of Nigerians are not able to afford $1 a day. And there was a day recently I made a post and I asked people, so this natural gas that people used to cook, the cooking gas, and I was asking them, so the price just shoots up recently, and people are saying, okay, fine, we are not using gas anymore. We want to use charcoal. using firewood. That's cheaper. And that's the sentiment. People have gas at home, but they can't afford it. Even though gas is not, the LNG is not, the best in form of clean energy, but it's a cleaner energy in that way. But people are even abandoning that. And so someone who's not able to afford $1 a day and has got trees behind him, just go to the forest, fell down the trees, turn it into firewood, charcoal, and, goes on with his whole life. So those are the issues. That's on the part of the majority of people who want to hold government to account. Talk about the media, talk about civil society organizations. A lot of people are already asking questions. But again, when you ask someone a question, the problem is that what are the realities? The government themselves, what are they doing? If the government's body language also, continue to encourage, development in the oil and gas sector, without necessarily, of course, with plans, the NDC is there, a lot of policy statements are ongoing, in a way, but the reality, and I try not to, when I try to speak about issues, when I try to look at the issues, I try to look at the realities on ground. Mm-hmm. The development program of the government, with the dependence on oil, is not being fulfilled. If oil is not there anymore, the question becomes, what's the alternative? Right. And what's the government doing realistically and intentionally? And again, if the government, the President Buhari would leave next year in 2023, what becomes worse if the next government comes on board? Right, the government is making both claims today, but it's got to be only 2 years to the end of its tenure. So what happens if the next government, just says, see, I don't care about what the former president said. I just want to pursue my own agenda. Because political statements are made based on how do I want to be popular? How do I want to get acceptance from the people? Not really about, you get that. So those are the issues that I think we should, continue to ask questions about.
Yeah, that's such an important reality check. The problem is hunger. 45% of people unable to call up $1 a day. The alternative to gas not being windmills and solar, but right. Charcoal, right?
And even the charcoal, people are saying charcoal is even expensive for them.
Yeah.
The charcoal that they said charcoal is even expensive.
Right.
So what do you tell them? So how do you tell someone in the village who's not there to say, see, charcoal is not, apart from the fact that it's not good for the environment, your own health. But they will say, see, what do you have for me? That's the question.
Yeah. Akintoni, thank you so much. We'll come back to you, I'm sure. And I'm seeing Roderick Cave in the chat. I'd like to come to you in a minute. But first, Natalie Bennett, former leader of the Green Party. Thank you so much for joining us from London. What do you make of all this? Are the national oil companies just doing what they've got to do to support the countries where they're based?
Well, just a small correction. I'm actually in Glasgow, although sorry, I haven't joined you in the venue this morning.
You're in Glasgow, all right. Sorry.
That's all right. Well, I think just looking at the framing of this to start off with, I think it's really important that we acknowledge that this meeting isn't an attack on divestment campaigns, which have actually done an enormous amount of good, particularly highlighting the issue, getting it on the agenda. I've known lots of people in universities, in many different organisations who've done an enormous amount of work. So I think that was a step in the process, and what we're talking about now is the next steps in the process. And I think I saw a comment flashing across the screen from the audience talking about corruption. And first of all, we have to acknowledge that corruption is a huge global North problem. That's where most of the money comes from. The money is paid. If were I in London, I would be pointing up the road and saying the City of London is the centre of global corruption. And I think it was very interesting what Valerie said about the hedge funds, buying up some of the dirtiest assets. There was an interesting piece in the Financial Times a couple of weeks ago now. I've actually just tweeted it out for anyone who's interested, looking at how, again, it's the financial sector that's threatening the security of us all, a financial sector that's out of control, that doesn't pay taxes, that is fundamentally corrupt. So that's the background to all of this. And so, it's important that we don't frame the poorest people in the world as the problem. What we need is, and I point to a couple of efforts that are really trying to look at this holistically. There's the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which has got 100 peace laureates signed up to it, 2,500 scientists and academics, and it's very much focuses on a peaceful, just transition, which addresses some of the points that Akintunde was just saying. And there's also, I mean, next week there'll be a launch of the parliamentarians' call for a fossil-free future. So this is the responsibility of all. It's not a case of going, oh, well, we've cleaned up our act and now it's you've got to sort it all out yourselves. Really important we don't frame it that way. And we also have to ask the question, we've traditionally measured emissions in terms of territorial emissions. That means where the carbon dioxide is emitted. But if you look at the Independent Committee on Climate Change in the UK, set up by the Climate Change Act, it's increasingly calling for us to look at consumption emissions. And I may be giving her an impossible question, but I'd be really interested from Valerie, any thoughts on how much of the NOCs, their production is consumed domestically? And of course, if more production switches to them, how much is being exported? Because if it's us still burning the oil, wherever it comes from, then I would say that we have to take responsibility for the consumption, not just the production. And of course, if we stop that consumption, then that's going to be a powerful impact of reducing the need, reducing any point in producing it. But of course, as Akintunde said, we have to give people an alternative. And that means, we've seen some positives with Indonesia and South Africa, helped for transition away from coal support, technological support for renewables. But we've really got to get to the point of saying this needs to be available to everyone, the support available to everyone. How do you manage a grid with those things? There's a lot of, we've taken the wealth from the global south. We've got to give a great deal back. And indeed, the issue of debt and debt relief that Akintunde also touched upon.
Thanks, Natalie. And yes, we should come back, Valerie, and give you a chance to tell us a bit about the consumption map, if it's possible to look forward and see how that's evolving and the extent to which NOCs are contributing to that. But Natalie, let me pick you up on your mention of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. What kind of traction does that have? Because I genuinely want to get clear in my own mind whether there's a movement. And as you say, the divestment as it relates to the majors is a first step, and now we need to move on to the next steps, or whether, as I suggested right at the top, we're kidding ourselves and there's a whole nother oily world out there. And I'm not trying to, I take your point about the framing, I'm not trying to sort of demonize the poorest, most oil and gas dependent parts of the world. I'm just trying to give ourselves a reality check. So on that, the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, tell us a bit more about it.
Well, I think it's very much being driven by civil society, as so much of the positive things are. And it's also, I think, particularly driven by health professionals, people looking at the impact of burning oil and gas, which has an impact. And Akintunde was talking about, gas stoves in buildings that may well not be very well ventilated and all the health impacts of that. So I think it's something that's driven by civil society. I wouldn't say at the moment, there's a lot of people signed up to it. I would imagine the public awareness of it generally around the world is very low. But this is one of the examples of the sort of things that can actually be picked up, perhaps by divestment campaigns who, if you've had a win in your university and your university is agreed to, go through divestment, if you can see this divestment happening around you in the global north, this is a way, and this focus on just transition is a way of really addressing the sort of issues that Akintunde was talking about. So what we're talking about are the next stages. We've made progress, and I think that's a really important thing to say about COP in general. I mean, you asked a question at the start about how COP's going, and COP is going, perhaps I would say, a little bit better than people have been expecting, but it's also never was going to deliver anything like what we actually need. It's in no way any kind of endpoint. This is a process, and all of the work needs to continue urgently on COP26 day +1 and keep going. And if we look at that as a process, as always saying what comes next, then I would say the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty is one of those things. That kind of approach is what comes next.
And sorry, just on that, who signs up? Organizations or countries or both?
Organisations, individuals. It's very much a civil society-driven campaign from the grassroots up. And I also mentioned the parliamentarians for a fossil-free future. That's where there's more focus then on the government side in that one, and the two I think very much fit together.
Okay, thanks so much. I mentioned that I wanted to come to Roderick Cave from the chat, but also Emma, who is identified in the chat as Emma and Tom J, is making a really interesting point. But first, so that we keep the thread of the conversation, can I come back to Valerie? Valerie, in broad terms, where do the NOCs oil go? How much of it is exported to developed countries?
Well, of course, it varies so much from NOC to NOC, but my guesstimate would be, from thinking of a couple NOCs in response to Natalie's question, would be maybe, I think, a third of their production is often consumed domestically. And that consumption is often the sort of the dirtier, lower quality production, because it's not as valuable to export. Right. It's often subsidized in a lot of the established big producer countries. So there's a problem with that consumption currently, but I think that it could be much lower emissions than exports, because every time you add transport, and if you're thinking of gas, if you're gasifying, liquefying, then regasifying, that's also high emissions. So there is a great potential to really reduce emissions of the national consumption of what NOCs produce. There should be some policy changes on subsidies, that's for sure, because that really increases the the sort of wasteful consumption. But I think there's a lot of scope for improvement there, and the fact that it's within the control of the government to impact the emissions to scope 3 of everything that they consume means that theoretically it's within their control to make things really change and improve on that front. So I think it's really an interesting avenue to look at.
Right, and on that, can you just give us something to be cheerful about? Are there any countries, currently obviously oil and gas dependent, which could make a wholesale transition to renewables? For example, let's take Saudi. And you hear from Mohammed bin Salman that they want to diversify. They've got a huge pavilion here at COP telling us all about NEOM, the new city, which is going to be a massive producer of green hydrogen, etc. Is this for the birds, or could Saudi, now synonymous with oil, become synonymous with massive utility scale solar?
I think it's very challenging for Saudi Arabia to diversify. I think that they are putting a lot of money into different ventures. We haven't seen very successful or credible diversification progress, but they should continue to try, because they don't have a choice. I think some of the more promising companies some of the companies that could most convincingly transform into national energy companies are the ones where there's less dependence on oil, I would say, where the whole economy is not as dependent on oil. And you do see some companies, some small companies that have become energy companies, like the Petroleum Corporation of Jamaica. And Colombia is also a notable one. I think Ecopetrol is quite interesting. It's really focused on cleaning up its production and increasing renewables production. So there are several good sort of transformation stories. And I think you quoted the Danish company, of course, at the beginning, which is important, like a sort of trailblazer.
Right. Okay. let me ask briefly then on that, and only briefly, is the kind of thing that Denmark did, that Dong did to become Ørsted, only possible for a very high per capita income country, or is there in principle no bar to that happening in the developing world?
No, I think, if you think of all the NOCs that have a production that is going to be too expensive or too dirty to keep producing, they won't have a market for it anymore. The world, the oil industry and world sort of climate policies may just force them to reinvent themselves. It'll be out of lack of options. And actually, there are quite a few NOCs that have fallen in that category. So the earlier they move to diversify their portfolio and to start to really invest in renewables or different kinds of cleaner projects, I think they'll be more resilient, and they'll be providing the energy to their population that the population needs.
Thanks so much, Roderick. I want to come back to you because what you're saying looks very interesting, but I don't quite understand it. Can we come to you, Roderick Cave?
Well, certainly. Can you hear me?
Yeah. You were saying that getting transparent, accountable public companies to sell dirty energy assets doesn't seem like a win at all. Agreed. Where is that happening?
Well, I can't really qualify myself as an expert on oil and gas divestment. I've worked mainly in mining and metals and fertilizer. But I would say that I've certainly seen examples of divestment where whether it's a future expectation of people exercising bankruptcy options, or simply a very short-term, non-future based operating model, where divestment leaves assets in the hands of people without very much accountability, and as a consequence, sees the assets operated, optimally in the short term, which is make as much money as you can. That's sort of more income statement operation than balance sheet statement operation, I would call it. There's no intention to sell the asset further on, and then a timely bankruptcy or sale perhaps to a shell company with no assets leaves the problem for society at large. So I guess what I'm saying is, without a lot of in-depth knowledge of the oil and gas sector, if the assets aren't being shut down, if they're just being divested, then I believe leaving the domain of transparent, publicly accountable companies with considerable resources, able to show stewardship for the assets that they're responsible for, isn't a win. I don't see it that way if there's no future view on how the assets are being shut down and what's happening with them. And I would also say in some of the comments about North and South, it's generally local actors that are stepping into the breach in this situation, and many of them are extremely wealthy. So I don't know if it's a really viable paradigm for addressing this as a problem. In most cases, I've spent a large part of my career in the former Soviet Union in commodities and Central Asia and Eastern Europe. The local interests that are controlling the assets and have the majority of the benefit from it. So I'm not sure it's a North and South issue at all. It seems more like a governance question, and that we've created a system that sort of purports to rely on a future traceability or scope 3 analysis that, one, doesn't exist yet, and two, still, there will be a scope 3 market driven by access to the EU, potentially North America, maybe China will get on board, but the rest of the world is still pretty big, and it doesn't seem that the global investment in energy supply and new supply is leaving coal, and I certainly don't think it would be leaving energy either. So we kind of create two different streams of energy investment without offering the financing to developing countries at very low rates of financing that you need for infrastructure, which is what essentially green energy is. It's just a lot of. Anyways, I'm rambling on, but my point is, I think the framing of the discourse is a bit flawed, and then I just used the coal industry and examples of divestment there as a case in point, and I would just raise that for discussion. I don't mean to be attacking, but just to say this is an important question to consider.
Right. Thank you. Yeah. I take your point that certainly in the regions that you have experience in, very important players obviously in oil and gas. The north-south framing may be wrong, but Emma, can we come to you because you're concerned about a particular aspect, if we can stick for a moment with the north-south framing. Are you there?
I'm here.
Hi, Emma. So you're saying that this raises some really interesting philosophical questions. Would you like to expand just a little bit on that?
So I just basically said, Giles, in the commentary that for me, it raises about how the whole questions about international relations, nation building, colonialism, the things that we have been concerned about in other areas, and how we work with countries to enable them to have the futures that they deserve and we have benefited from. We have had in the past. And that's not trying to be too romantic about a view of what, you know, their futures might look like, but it is trying to be aspirational.
Right, but are you at the same time worried about a new form of colonialism as a journalistic shorthand? Let's say condescension, or I mean.
No, I don't think that. No, Giles, I don't think that. But I think it's just one we have to be aware of as we build, as we work with countries. And I think, and I don't want to be negative towards China, but I do think it is very interesting to look at what China and Russia are doing in terms of African development and where they are putting in resources, and how we therefore, mindful that we don't want to be colonialistic, and I don't, we work with those countries in a very different way. We have a different kind of partnership. And I think actually it presents a huge opportunity. But it requires us to look beyond our borders.
Right. Well, this is a good moment to come back to Akintunde and the Nigerian example, I think. But feel free to talk about other examples if you like. But you made the point so clearly and forcefully that the aspiration is there, but the alternative to oil and gas isn't yet. The books are read. There's no other obvious way of funding the development agenda that President Buhari has set out. What's going to happen?
Okay, in the speech, when the president was making his speech, he said, you know, his aspirations are there. He's looking for partners. The government is looking for partners for development, partners for investors in the country. But I want to look, I mean, when you look at the whole conversation, the technology to advance, you know, away from, so to divest, is not there in the country. Local, I mean, and we have a lot of, you know, the country is already doing fantastically well in the tech space, the technology space.
Right.
But the point is, how are we able to, I mean, I believe that it's important for the country to get on away from fossil fuel, because even if they don't, you know, if any country is not doing that, no matter what market we have, in 2040, in 2050, at some point, you know, it becomes, you know, nobody would get on it again the moment we have that. You know, the world we live, you know, any country that's still doing the business of oil behind very soon.
Right.
You know, I don't know when. I mean, we've got a trajectory, but I also know that as much as population continue to expand, the energy demand continue to expand and all of that. But I think if investors are looking at the country, I think there are also peculiar situations that we should look at. One of those would be the investment environment, you know, the policy processes, you know, the body language of the government when it comes to ease of doing business, you know, the policies that are there. I mean, yeah, you want people to come and invest, but the problem is, are you really open to investment? And the investment in the country, with the government side of it, is the government also interested in making sure that whatever development would also get to the people? And I want to make this point. If the world, let's assume a scenario now, that the world allow Nigeria to continue to do the business of oil and gas in the worst way possible until 2100, let's just assume. Mm-hmm. Will Nigeria really develop? Let's agree that the world allow Nigeria, I mean, you know, in the context of the current configuration, we've done the oil business for many years now. What evidence do we have that is to speak about, people getting out of poverty or infrastructures and all of that? And that also comes to the fact that is the government sincerely committed to development in that space? Are they just interested in, enriching certain persons, or divert, the biggest corruption case in the country, if you look at all of this Malibu scandal, a lot of corruption cases in the country, you will notice that from the oil and gas sector. So as much as we're talking about reaching net zero by 2060, according to the president, and all of that, how are we looking at, are we potentially looking at a possibility of diversion of, investment in the energy sector, in the renewable energy sector? The Green Board recently, the government had wanted to plant trees, their afforestation program is using a green bond. And there was a particular project in Oyo State, they wanted to plant trees. But unfortunately, a recent investigation by Premium Times showed that, there are almost no trees planted. So even in the midst of all of this conversation, current investment in tree planting or all of that, they are still being, you don't even get financials for, you don't get value for money. So those are the questions we should look at. As much as even if the investors are there in the country, what mechanisms do we have to, to curb corruption, to eliminate as much as we can, so that we don't end up doing all of these and people are still, in the next 10 years, people are still in poverty. Because at the end of the day, we should pay attention to all of that. So I believe that the government should be sincere in all of what they are doing, and I also think investors should look at Nigeria and Africa as an opportunity, really. There is the market. If you want to do the business, there is the market for, in that space. So it's not you coming to do Nigeria a favor or coming to do Africa a favor. In my opinion, it's you coming to do business, and you make your money. Right. It's you coming to do the business. But the most important thing is that if you want to do the business, the government should create an enabling environment for investment to come around, and they should make reasonable demands, so that all of these demands should also pay attention to the people that this would affect, that it's correctly affecting anyways at the end of the day. Because whatever policy you're trying to get on board that doesn't pay attention, the government had spoken about the fact that the president rather, that climate change is not a threat in Nigeria, is a reality. But the point is, what has the government done realistically?
Just in concrete terms, finally, and then I want to give Valerie and Natalie a chance to have a final word. In 2100, if Nigeria has managed to diversify away from oil and gas, if its population remains north of 200 million, how is the country powered?
That's it. We should look. If we look at all of, the power generation process in the country right now is still very terrible. A lot of investment, a lot of partnerships, and all of that. You still don't get evidence of that.
So it'll be a mixture of hydro, solar.
Right. It's all of that. But yeah. There are places in Nigeria that the last time they even had electricity was like 10 years ago.
The last time they had electricity was 10 years ago.
There are places there that the last time they had was, there are some places that 3 years, 4 years. You have all of that. So it's all that complicated. It's all that the realities. That was why I was saying that 2060 sounds like a good, pronouncement.
Yeah.
But again, have we tried to do a costing of how much the development that the government would aim to get, how much would it cost in realistic terms, per person, and how are we dealing with it, in terms of the government policy on, poverty eradication, and, helping to, engage all of that process, and to look at what COVID has done to the country, in terms of people getting out of jobs and all of that, and the realistic processes about it. I'm used to the Nigerian government making fantastic claims, making fantastic policies, but again, how do we implement realistically to get to the results, so that we know that and the world will take us serious.
Thank you so much, Natalie. I'm sorry that the clock's ticking round, so we will have to be brief. But you speak about the sort of incremental process and next steps. Let's come back to the question of NOCs, the challenge of finding pressure points and leverage to encourage them all over the world, not just to clean up their act, but to transition themselves. After the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, look ahead a little bit. What are the next steps beyond that?
Well, again, I think we've been talking about, Valerie and others have been talking about, the NOCs transitioning to renewable energy companies. I think we can, we have a problem as those companies are structured in a way, a neoliberal way. Emma was talking about neo-colonialism. Certain kinds of structures by the IMF, the World Bank, organizations like that, forced a certain sort of structure, an exploitative, extractive kind of culture, an approach on those companies. I'd really like to go back to democracy and the idea of community energy. And renewables, particularly solar, really lend themselves to this. So if we think about some of those areas of Nigeria that don't have power, and some of those actually are, I believe, are areas where there's actually huge oil and gas reserves, and perhaps that's being pumped out in a pipeline going past people, but they still haven't got any electricity. What we need to see is, instead of thinking about taking the model we have now for fossil fuels and just transferring it to renewables, a much more decentralized, people-focused, people-controlled kind of model. And that's what renewables actually really lend themselves to do. The classic model is Africa went straight from no telephones to mobile phones with no landlines in the middle. If we go straight to village level, locally controlled renewable sources with democracy, any question you ask me what the answer is, democracy will be it. And energy democracy really has to be a huge part of this story, rather than just business as usual with a different technology.
Energy democracy, great, let's cling to that. Valerie, last word for you. You mentioned Jamaica, you mentioned Colombia, but we have also talked about Saudi. We haven't talked much about Russia. Fast forward, if you will, to 2050. What are the big OPEC plus players looking like then? Are they still pumping out oil and selling it at whatever price the markets will bear? Or is there any hope that large-scale transition will be underway even in those core oil and gas countries?
Yeah, I think I would expect that we'll see sort of two parallel NOC worlds developing. Well, you'll have, a set of NOCs that's trading within a carbon-constrained kind of market or carbon-priced market, and cleaning up, greening their production, as they call it. And you'll have another set of NOCs that is really struggling with declining export revenues, the dependence of their population on that rent. Like I'm thinking of Venezuela, for example. Will they have money to invest in greening their production or reducing emissions? So I think it's really important to go back to the point on equity for this, and to think those NOCs do need the support of like technical assistance, finance, technology transfer to help them reduce emissions, so that if they will pump, then at least let's make it lower emission, and then also focus on corruption, governance, and other ways to clean up that sector nationally, so that the outcome is better for that population.
Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for joining us. Valerie, Natalie Bennett, Akintunde Babatunde, thank you so much. I should try to pull a few strands together. I'm in negative time. I'll just pick out the single sort of words that I've scribbled down. Hunger. Hunger is a priority we have to remember in so many parts of the world where we're talking about net zero and windmills and solar panels, hunger and charcoal, places with no power for 10 years. This is a reality check that I think is so important. And it makes it more important rather than less that the rich world heeds appeals from leaders like Narendra Modi for trillions, not billions. Civil society, and Natalie's example just now of the communications leapfrog undertaken by many people in the developing world, from no phones to cell phones. Can we make a reality of an energy equivalent of that? One of the sort of galvanizing thoughts is that we have to. There is no alternative, isn't it? So, in a sense, it's bracing, but powerful. And we've heard some encouraging words about NOCs that do manage to clean up their acts. And perhaps as a final point, we came into this conversation, and I blame myself for this, ready to demonize NOCs. Perhaps we can think of them as a pressure point and part of the solution, not the problem. At least we know they're there, we know what they're doing, and the next steps, to use Natalie's framing, are to increase engagement and provide the finance and technology to help them and everyone else make the transitions required. It is about 9:35. We've got coffee and pastries here in the New York Times Hub. We've got another Thinking tomorrow at 8:30. Thank you very much for joining us, and do check out today's Net Zero SenseMaker special on the Tortoise app, which takes a somewhat skeptical look at Rishi Sunak's announcement of 130 trillion for climate finance yesterday, with caveats, of course, but I think it deserves some skepticism. Thanks very much, everyone, for joining us. See you again soon.